A billionaire sneered at a young waitress and demanded she serve him authentic Arabic coffee, certain no one her age would remember the ancient customs. She didn't argue. She simply began the 7-step ritual her grandmother had taught her. Roasting, grinding, brewing with cardamom, the precise pour, serving the eldest first. As she moved through each sacred gesture, his contempt dissolved into something else entirely. Tears filled his eyes when he realized she'd awakened a memory he'd spent decades trying to bury. Her name was Layla, a 24-year-old hospitality student working at a luxury Gulf hotel to pay for her degree. The man at the table introduced himself as Sheikh Omar bin Rashid, a businessman who claimed direct descent from Bedouin royalty. He'd arrived with an entourage, dismissed 3 other servers as incompetent, and loudly declared that no young person today could possibly honor the sacred traditions of Arabic coffee. He was wrong. Layla carried something far more valuable than a job title. She carried her grandmother's teachings, passed down in a modest village kitchen decades before any hotel ever existed. The question wasn't whether she could perform the ritual. It was whether this man, who had traded his heritage for wealth, could still recognize what he'd lost. That question would be answered not in that hotel lobby, but in the silent space between tradition and memory, a space Layla's grandmother had spent a lifetime teaching her to navigate. To understand what happened that afternoon, you need to go back, not minutes or hours. Back decades to a small village in the Al-Hajar Mountains of Oman, where the scent of cardamom and roasting coffee beans drifted from an open kitchen window every morning before dawn. Layla was born into a world where coffee was never just a drink. It was a language. Her earliest memories were of waking to the crackle of green coffee beans in a cast iron pan, the sound of her grandmother Amina humming ancient melodies as she stirred. Amina was 73 then, her hands gnarled but steady, her eyes sharp enough to see into your soul. She was the village Hafidha, the keeper of customs that stretched back 12 centuries to the Ethiopian highlands and the Yemeni Sufi mystics who first brewed kahwa as a sacrament of hospitality. The ritual Layla would one day perform had 7 sacred steps, and Amina taught them as if they were verses of scripture. Step 1. Roasting. The beans must be heated over a gentle flame, stirred constantly in a mahoma, a flat iron pan, until they turn the color of amber, never darker. The roaster's intention mattered, Amina said. You could not roast with anger in your heart, the bitterness would seep into the brew. Step 2. Grinding. The cooled beans were crushed with a mortar and pestle until coarse, not fine, the grind had to breathe. Step 3. Boiling. The water must first come to a rolling boil, then the coffee added, then the cardamom pods crushed just before hitting the surface so the oils remain volatile. Step 4. The steep. Exactly 10 minutes of simmering, no more no less, the dalla pot tilted at a precise angle. Step 5. The pour. The dalla held high, the stream thin and constant, landing in the cup without a single drop wasted. Step 6. The serve. Pour with the left hand, present with the right. The cup never filled more than 1/3, and always the eldest guest receives the first cup. Step 7. The gesture of completion. After the guest drinks, the server inclines the head slightly and touches the right hand to the heart, an acknowledgement that the offering is given freely, without expectation. Amina taught Layla that each step contained hidden wisdom. The roasting taught patience. The grinding taught that all strength comes from being broken. The boiling taught that transformation requires heat. The pour taught precision under pressure. And the serve, that taught dignity. To serve another human being is not servitude, Amina said. It is the highest act of civilization. Hospitality in Arab culture is so sacred that the word for generosity, karam, shares its root with nobility. There is no honor greater than making someone feel welcomed, seen, and valued. Coffee is the medium, but the offering is always bigger than the cup. By the time she was 12, Layla could replicate the entire ritual blindfolded. She knew how to read a guest's mood by how they held their fengel, how the angle of their sip indicated comfort or caution. She learned that coffee was the first thing offered at weddings, at funerals, at business negotiations and peace settlements. In Bedouin tradition, if you entered a tent and were given coffee, you were under the host's protection. Your life was safe. Your enemies could not touch you. This was not folklore. This was law, older than nations, written in the desert wind. But war has a way of burning through traditions. When Layla was 15, regional conflict spilled into the mountain villages. Her father lost his government job when the ministry building was shelled. Her mother fell ill, medical care was scarce, and the family's savings evaporated. Amina died quietly one evening, her last words instructing Layla to never let the ritual die. 2 months later, Layla and her younger brother Yusuf boarded a bus to Muscat, then a flight to Dubai, where an uncle had arranged work permits at a construction company. She was 16. Her childhood was over. Dubai was a shock of glass towers and artificial islands. The city gleamed with wealth, but for migrant workers, it was a labyrinth of 12-hour shifts, shared rooms in labor camps, and employers who held your passport. Layla refused to let that be her ending. She studied at night, learning English from a Syrian neighbor who had been a literature professor before the war took everything. She earned a scholarship to study hospitality management at a university in Sharjah, cobbling together the remaining fees with part-time work at hotels. Her mother's illness had left medical debts, and her brother Yusuf dreamed of becoming an engineer, so every dirham Layla earned was split between tuition, debt, and her brother's future. The luxury hotel where she now worked, a 5-star behemoth off the Sheikh Zayed Road, paid better than most, but the cost was invisibility. She was expected to smile, serve, and disappear, and for 3 years that was exactly what she did. Then came the afternoon that would change everything. December 14th, a Tuesday, the hotel manager, Mr. Patel, called an emergency meeting for all serving staff. A VIP was arriving. Sheikh Omar bin Rashid, a petroleum and real estate magnate whose net worth topped $3.8 billion. His family name was old. The Al-Rashid clan had been tribal leaders in Eastern Arabia for generations, but Omar's personal story was one of self-invention. He had left his village at 17, worked on an oil rig in Kuwait, talked his way into a partnership in a struggling logistics firm, and within 2 decades built an empire spanning 12 countries. He was known for hard tactics, for demanding perfection, and for despising anything he considered inauthentic. And according to Patel, he was coming for a business meal with 3 potential partners, and he wanted traditional Arabic coffee service exactly as his ancestors would have received it. The hotel had an espresso bar, a tea sommelier, a French patisserie chef, but no one on staff specialized in ceremonial kahwa. Most of the younger servers had only tasted instant Arabic coffee or the spiced versions sold at Mal kiosks. Patel was frantic. He ordered the staff to watch YouTube tutorials, to borrow a dollar from a cultural center to wing it. But when the Sheikh's entourage arrived, 4 men in crisp white thobes, one wearing the gold-trimmed bisht of a tribal elder, the tension in the lobby could have cracked glass. The first server approached with a trembling tray. The Sheikh dismissed him with a wave. The second server presented a pre-ground blend from a supermarket. He didn't even bother speaking. A single glance from his security guards sent her retreating. The third server tried to pour with the wrong hand and spilled a drop. That was the moment Omar stood up, his voice cutting through the marble silence. "Is there no one in this entire hotel who respects the coffee of my fathers? No one who understands what this means? You treat it like instant powder from a jar, and you call this a luxury establishment. This is not coffee. This is an insult to my heritage and to my mother who served it with her own hands. Sit down, all of you, you are useless." The dining room froze. Mr. Patel turned pale. The business partners exchanged uncomfortable glances, and then from the service corridor, a quiet voice rose. Layla had been assigned to another floor, but she'd heard the commotion through the staff radio. She walked into the room carrying nothing but her own memories. With her head held high, she looked directly at the billionaire and said, "If you will allow me, Sheikh Omar, I can prepare your coffee, not the hotel's version." "My grandmother," Omar scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "Your grandmother, a girl your age, you grew up on lattes and social media. What do you know of the desert traditions, the stirring of the mahoma, the angle of the pour? You will waste my time." He sat back, expecting her to retreat like the others. Instead, Layla nodded politely and asked for permission to retrieve the proper tools. Patel, desperate, whispered for her to hurry. When she returned 10 minutes later, she carried a small wooden box she'd kept in her locker for months. a box she'd brought from her village, packed with Amina's own pan, her mortar and pestle, a bundle of green beans from their last harvest, and a single silver dollar etched with verses from the Quran. She set it down on the cloth-covered table before the sheikh. Omar stared at the box, then at her. Something in his expression flickered, a shadow of curiosity or perhaps dread, because he recognized that box, or at least the type of box worn smooth by decades of loving hands. But the arrogance returned quickly, and he gestured impatiently. "Begin then. Show me what your grandmother taught you." Layla lit the flame, placed the pan over the blue fire, and poured the pale green beans into the iron. The first crackle filled the silent room. As she began to stir with slow, deliberate circles, the billionaire leaned forward, his smirk fading, because the smell that rose from that pan was not just roasting coffee. It was the scent of 1,000 mornings long buried. It was the smell of his mother's kitchen, the memory of a language he had forced himself to forget, and the first crack in the fortress he'd built around his soul. He didn't yet know that by the 7th step, he would be weeping. But the room did. The first crack of the beans was like a gunshot in the silent room. Layla didn't flinch. She had heard that sound 1,000 times in her grandmother's kitchen, the sharp pop that meant the green shells were splitting, releasing the oils that held the soul of the coffee. The mahoma pan was heavy, older than the hotel itself, and it radiated heat in waves that blurred the air. She stirred slowly, clockwise then counterclockwise, the rhythm her grandmother had called the heartbeat of hospitality. Across the table, Sheikh Omar bin Rashid had gone very still. His entourage exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. The smirk that had defined his entrance was gone, replaced by something harder to name, a tension around the eyes, a tightening of the jaw. He was watching her hands as if they were performing an autopsy on a buried memory. The roasting took 5 minutes, every second stretched taut. Layla didn't rush. She knew that temperature was everything. The beans had to reach a light golden brown just before the first wisp of smoke became visible. Burn them, and the coffee turned bitter, a mistake no true host could forgive. Under-roast them, and the flavor stayed vegetal, incomplete. Her grandmother Amina had taught her to read the color like a sailor reads the sky, to know the exact moment by scent alone. And now, as that scent filled the hotel's private dining room, it was doing something no amount of money could orchestrate. It was traveling. For Omar, the smell was a time machine. He was suddenly 7 years old, sitting cross-legged on a woven mat in a mud brick house in the village of Al-Hisn. His mother, Fatima bint Rashid, was at the hearth, her abaya sleeve rolled up past her elbow, her hands performing the same motion Layla now made. She had the same deliberation, the same quiet confidence. Every morning she roasted beans while his father, a fisherman, sharpened his knives and hummed old pearl-diving songs. The family had nothing, no electricity, no running water, a single goat that gave milk twice a day. But in that kitchen, surrounded by the smell of kawa, Omar had felt rich. He had felt safe. That feeling had been buried for so long he'd convinced himself it never existed. But here it was, dragged back by a stranger's hands over a portable stove in a Dubai hotel. Layla lifted the pan from the flame and poured the roasted beans onto a flat wooden tray to cool. She took the mortar and pestle from her grandmother's box and began to grind. Step 2. The coarse crush of the beans, not too fine, just enough to release the body without turning to dust. The sound was rhythmic, almost musical, and each strike of the pestle seemed to land somewhere deep in Omar's chest. He remembered now. His mother would let him do this part, his small hands struggling to grip the heavy stone, and she would laugh and guide his wrist. That laugh, he hadn't heard it in 40 years. He had left Al-Hisn at 17 with nothing but a duffel bag and a promise to himself to never be poor again, and somewhere along the way, he had stopped calling his mother, stopped visiting, sent money but never his presence. She had died alone while he closed a deal in Geneva, and he'd flown back only for the funeral, leaving before the 3 days of mourning were complete because an acquisition was pending. He had told himself it was ambition. It was necessity. But the grinding sound called it what it was, abandonment, dressed in a suit and tie. Layla set a copper kettle over the flame and brought water to a rolling boil. She dropped the ground coffee into the pot, then took a handful of green cardamom pods from a cloth pouch and crushed them between her palms, releasing the volatile oils into the steam. Amina had always insisted on this. Crush just before adding, never grind in advance, because the soul of cardamom evaporates within minutes of breaking. Layla added the pods to the pot and let the mixture boil for exactly 10 seconds before reducing the heat to a simmer. Step 3. Step 4. The dalla pot stood ready, its curved spout gleaming like a crescent moon. The room was no longer silent, it was breathless. Mr. Patel, the hotel manager, had forgotten his panic and was simply watching, his clipboard hanging limp. One of Omar's business partners, a German investor named Klaus, who had spent the morning discussing market share projections, felt an inexplicable lump in his throat. The security guards, trained to scan for threats, had lowered their gaze to the floor, caught in the gravity of something they didn't understand. And Layla, she was no longer in the hotel. She was back in the mountain village, her grandmother's voice in her ear, the words as clear as the day they were spoken. "You are not making coffee, Habibti. You are opening a door. Some guests will walk through, some will stand at the threshold and weep. Either way, you have done your duty." The simmer ended. Layla lifted the dalla from the flame and held it high, her wrist bent at the angle Amina had trained into her muscle memory. Step 5. The pour. A thin, unbroken stream of amber liquid descended into the first fengel, the small handleless cup that had been warmed just moments before. The stream was steady, not a single drop lost, the sound a soft whisper against porcelain. She filled the cup exactly 1/3, as tradition demanded, enough to taste, not so much that it would cool before the guest finished. Then she moved to the second cup, then the third for the business partners, and finally a fourth cup for the sheikh. But before she could present it, she paused. The eldest must receive the first cup. That was the rule. And in this room, despite his wealth and his entourage, Omar bin Rashid was unmistakably the eldest. She took the first cup in her left hand, transferred it to her right in a fluid motion, and stepped toward him. Step 6. Omar looked at the small cup, then at Layla, then back at the cup. His hands, which had signed billion-dollar contracts and commanded boardrooms across 3 continents, were shaking. He reached out and took the fengel, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. The coffee's surface trembled. He swirled the cup gently, as tradition required, letting the grounds settle, and brought it to his lips. He drank, and the dam broke. It wasn't a single memory. It was all of them, crashing through the walls he'd spent a lifetime constructing. The taste was identical to his mother's coffee. Identical. Not similar, not reminiscent, exactly the same ratio of cardamom to bean, the same roast depth, the same touch of clove that only his mother had used, a secret ingredient she'd learned from her own mother and promised to pass down. But Omar had never learned it. He'd been too busy chasing wealth, and after she died, he'd assumed the recipe died with her. He'd spent decades searching for coffee that tasted like home, paying chefs and baristas and culinary consultants, and never once had anyone come close. Now a 24-year-old waitress with a wooden box and her grandmother's pan had handed him his entire childhood in 1/3 of a cup. Tears spilled over his cheeks before he could stop them. The room watched in stunned silence as one of the wealthiest men in the Gulf, a man known for ruthlessness and uncompromising standards, wept like a child. His security team, fiercely loyal and deeply uncomfortable, looked to Klaus, the German investor, for direction. Klaus shook his head. Nobody was to move, nobody was to speak. This was not a breakdown. This was an exhumation. Layla held her ground. She had seen people cry over her grandmother's coffee before, old men who tasted the echo of their wives, travelers who were reminded of homes they'd never see again. Amina had called it the Huzn al-Kawa, the coffee's sorrow, the way the brew unlocked grief and gratitude in equal measure. So Layla did what her grandmother would have done. She stepped back, touched her right hand to her heart, and inclined her head slightly. Step 7, the gesture of completion, an acknowledgement that the offering was given freely and required nothing in return. But Omar was not ready for it to end. He set down the cup with a clatter that broke the spell, rose from his chair, and looked directly at Layla. His voice, when he found it, was raw and unsteady. "Who are you? Where did you learn this? That coffee, it is my mother's coffee. Exactly the same, not similar. Hers. I have tried for 40 years to find this taste. I buried her without knowing how she made it. Who are you to bring it back?" The accusation in his words was directed not at Layla, but at himself, at the years he'd wasted, at the heritage he'd traded for board seats and stock options. But Layla didn't flinch. She answered quietly, "I am no one, Sheikh Omar. I am a student. My grandmother taught me, just as your mother must have been taught. The knowledge does not belong to me or to you. It belongs to everyone who has ever honored a guest." A long moment passed. Then Omar did something that even his closest advisors had never seen. He bent his head, not in a nod of acknowledgement, but in a gesture that, in the old ways, signified a man humbling himself before a teacher. "Your grandmother," he said, his voice cracking, "may Allah grant her paradise. And you have reminded me of what I buried long before my mother died. I came here today demanding authenticity from others when I had abandoned it myself. I owe you an apology. I owe you far more than that." He turned to Mr. Patel, who had been frozen near the service door for the duration of the ritual. "I want to know everything about this young woman, her story, her family, her ambitions." Patel stammered something about employee confidentiality, but Omar waved him off. "No, I do not mean for files or reports. I mean I want to speak with her. When her shift ends, I will be waiting in this hotel lobby. And if she is willing, I have a proposition that might change both of our lives." The room erupted in whispers. Klaus was already calculating the PR value. The security team relaxed marginally. Layla looked down at the wooden box, at her grandmother's tools, at the last green beans from a village she might never see again. She felt the weight of what was being offered, a door, just as Amina had promised, and the equal weight of knowing that walking through it would change her forever. She nodded once, a small gesture, and began to pack the box. Her shift was not over. There were tables to serve and plates to clear. The billionaire could wait in the lobby as long as he liked. The coffee ritual had taught her that all things come in their own time. But as she turned to leave the dining room, Omar's bodyguard stepped into her path and handed her a card with a private number. "He wasn't asking," the guard said, not unkindly. "He just doesn't know how to ask anymore." Layla tucked the card into her pocket and walked back to the service corridor. She had no way of knowing that a guest at the next table, a food blogger from London, had recorded the entire ritual on her phone, including Omar's tears, and was already uploading it to a platform with 2 million followers. She had no way of knowing that by morning, the video would have 8 million views, that hashtags like Sheikh Cries Over Coffee and 7-Step Miracle would trend across 3 continents, and that the hotel's reservation system would crash under the weight of inquiries. Most of all, she had no way of knowing that the proposition Omar was preparing to make would not be a simple job offer, a scholarship, or a one-time gift. It would be something far more complicated, involving his company's entire charitable foundation, a cultural preservation initiative spanning 7 countries, and a secret his own sons didn't know. A mistake he had made in his youth that only a woman with Layla's specific knowledge could help him rectify. And if she accepted, she would inherit not just opportunity, but a legacy of fire and betrayal that had been simmering in the Al-Rashid family for 2 generations, waiting for someone strong enough to finally turn off the flame. The video ignited faster than anyone could have predicted. Within 3 hours of its upload, the food blogger's post had crossed 1 million views. By midnight Dubai time, it was at 12 million and climbing. The footage was grainy, shot from an angle that caught the Sheikh's face in profile and Layla's steady hands in crystal clarity. The caption read, "Billionaire laughs at Waitress. Then she performs a 7-step Arabic coffee ritual his mother taught him. He breaks down. This is the most powerful thing I've ever witnessed." Journalists from Al Arabiya, the BBC, and CNN began calling the hotel switchboard before the breakfast shift started. Layla woke to 73 notifications from strangers, 12 interview requests, and a direct message from the Ministry of Culture offering an official commendation. She didn't feel celebrated. She felt hunted. The hotel lobby became a circus. Guests who had never set foot in Dubai booked rooms just to be near the story. International media crews set up camp on the sidewalk, their satellite trucks blocking traffic. Mr. Patel, who had been a night manager quietly climbing the corporate ladder, found himself thrust into daily press briefings he was entirely unprepared for. He stammered through statements about honoring our diverse culinary traditions, while privately emailing the corporate office in London to beg for guidance. The corporate office, a faceless entity headquartered in a glass tower near Heathrow, had no guidance to offer. They'd never faced a viral phenomenon rooted in heritage and tears. They sent a public relations consultant who immediately annoyed everyone by suggesting Layla wear a more marketable uniform for interviews. Layla declined. She continued wearing her server's vest and her grandmother's simple silver pendant, the one with a tiny Fengel charm that Amina had worn every day of her adult life. The real storm, however, was not in the media. It was inside Omar bin Rashid's family empire, the Al Rashid Group, a conglomerate that controlled shipping ports, luxury developments, and a charitable foundation with an annual budget of $200 million. The foundation had been run for the past 5 years by Omar's eldest son, Tariq, a 35-year-old with an MBA from Harvard and a deep suspicion of anything that couldn't be measured on a spreadsheet. Tariq had watched the viral video in his corner office on the 42nd floor of the Al Rashid Tower, and he had not been moved. He had been alarmed. His father, the ruthless titan who had built an empire on unemotional calculation, was weeping on the internet over a cup of coffee. To Tariq, this was not a heartwarming story. It was a liability, a crack in the brand, a signal to competitors that the old man was going soft. He summoned his younger brother, Rashid, a 28-year-old who managed the foundation's social media presence and spent most of his time curating Instagrammable charity moments. "Father is going to do something rash," Tariq said, the pun unintentional but accurate. "He's already postponed 3 meetings. He's been on the phone with legal all morning. I've intercepted a draft press release announcing a partnership with this waitress. We need to contain this before he commits company resources to a nostalgia project." Rashid, who had never known a day of real hardship, shrugged. "The video is great PR, everyone loves it." Tariq slammed his hand on the desk. "It's not PR we control. It's a stranger holding our family's emotional vulnerability hostage on the internet. Find out everything about her. Education, debts, family in Oman, anything that can be used to negotiate. We cannot let this turn into a foundation, rerouting our entire philanthropic strategy toward a coffee ceremony." While Tariq plotted containment, Layla was sitting across from Omar in a private suite on the hotel's top floor. The room was designed for royalty, gold leaf on the ceiling, a panoramic view of the Gulf, but Omar had dismissed all attendants and was brewing tea himself, his hands still slightly unsteady. The proposition he laid out was not what she expected. He did not offer her money. He did not offer her a job. He offered her an inheritance. His mother, Fatima bint Rashid, had been more than a housewife. She had been the unofficial keeper of the Al Hissan tribal coffee ceremony, a ritual that predated the oil boom and the skyscrapers by centuries. Before she died, she had entrusted Omar with a handwritten manuscript, a collection of recipes, oral histories, and tribal lineages connected to the 7-step ritual. He had locked it in a safe and never opened it. The guilt had calcified into ambition. Now he wanted to unlock it, but he couldn't do it alone. The manuscript was written in a dialect so old that even scholars struggled, and it referenced techniques that only a practitioner like Layla could interpret. The proposition was this: co-lead a cultural preservation initiative under the Al Rashid Foundation, document the 7-step ritual across 7 Gulf nations, and establish a living museum in Al Hissan dedicated to the coffee traditions of the Bedouin and mountain tribes. He would fund it entirely. She would guide it. And in doing so, he might finally make peace with his mother's ghost. Layla listened, her hands resting on the wooden box in her lap. She thought of Amina, who had died with her recipes unwritten, her knowledge living only in memory and muscle. She thought of her brother Yusuf, whose engineering tuition depended on her hotel salary. And she thought of the video, already spreading, already being analyzed and memed and stripped of its sacred context. The choice was not simply yes or no. It was whether to trust a man who had built his fortune on not trusting anyone. She asked for 24 hours. Omar granted it, though his eyes betrayed a desperation that suggested he was the one who couldn't afford refusal. The next morning, Layla received a visitor at her shared apartment in the Deira district, a cramped two-bedroom she split with 3 other hospitality students. The visitor was not a journalist. It was a woman in her 60s, dressed in a traditional abaya with intricate hand-stitching, her face lined and her gaze sharp. She introduced herself as Khalid, a name Layla recognized immediately. Khalid was a legend in Omani cultural circles, a woman who had single-handedly lobbied UNESCO to recognize Arabic kahwa as intangible cultural heritage in 2015. She had heard about the viral video and had flown from Muscat overnight. "I knew your grandmother," she said, sitting on the edge of Layla's thin mattress. Amina bint Rashid al-Jabri, she was not just a village Hafidha. She was one of the last living carriers of the full ceremonial lineage. I interviewed her in 1998. She told me she had taught a granddaughter who would one day carry the tradition forward. "I believe that granddaughter is you," Layla's heart hammered. Her grandmother had been a recognized culture bearer. She had never mentioned the interview, never hinted at any wider importance. And her full name, Amina bint Rashid al-Jabri, the surname was Rashid, the same as Omar's mother. Khalid's eyes softened. "You didn't know, your grandmother and the Sheikh's mother were cousins. They grew up in the same village. The coffee ritual you performed was not just any recipe. It was the al-Rashid family recipe passed through the maternal line for 12 generations. The Sheikh recognized it because it was his own. And there is more. The manuscript he has locked in his safe, it was written by your great-grandmother. Half of it is missing. The other half was held by a rival family who broke a peace covenant 50 years ago, a betrayal that resulted in a fire that destroyed half the village and killed 3 elders. The rivalry has never been settled, and the missing half of the manuscript is currently in the possession of a man named Khalid al-Balashi, the CEO of Balashi Heritage Holdings, a company that has been trying to patent and commercialize traditional Gulf coffee blends for the export market. He has lawyers in Geneva and lobbyists in Riyadh, and he is, by marriage, Tariq al-Rashid's father-in-law. The room seemed to spin. Layla understood now. This was not about a cup of coffee. It was about a family war fought over the ownership of cultural memory, with her at the center because she was the only person alive who could read the complete manuscript if both halves were reunited. Omar wanted to honor his mother and preserve the heritage. His son Tariq, through his marriage, was aligned with the rival family that wanted to commodify it, and the al-Balashi family had already begun filing intellectual property claims for traditional Arabic coffee preparation method and associated branding, citing photographs and descriptions that closely matched the 7 steps Layla had performed. If they succeeded, the ritual she'd learned from her grandmother could become a licensed product, sold in duty-free shops and franchised like a coffee chain, while the villages that created it received nothing. That evening, Layla received a call from an unknown number. The voice was polite and cold. It identified itself as an associate of Khalid al-Balashi's legal team. They offered her a contract, 500,000 dirhams, a furnished apartment in Dubai Marina, and a role as cultural ambassador for a new line of heritage coffee products. All she had to do was sign a non-disclosure agreement about the manuscript and stop any collaboration with Omar's foundation. If she refused, they had enough legal firepower to tie her in court for years, claiming she had misappropriated a trade secret that the al-Balashi family had been developing for decades. The call was not a threat, the voice said. It was an opportunity. Layla hung up, her hands shaking. She called Omar immediately. She told him everything Khalid had revealed. There was a long silence on the line, then a sound she hadn't expected, a bitter laugh. "So my son Tariq married into the family that burned my grandfather's house," Omar said. "I knew the Balashis were rivals, but I didn't know they held the missing half of my mother's manuscript. I thought it was lost." Tariq has been keeping secrets. This is no longer about charity, Layla. This is about restitution. Will you help me? Before she could answer, the hotel lobby erupted again. A formal cease and desist letter had been delivered by courier, addressed to Layla and the hotel management, signed by Khalid al-Balashi's legal firm. It demanded that all recordings of the seven-step ritual be removed from the internet, that Layla cease unauthorized performance of a proprietary cultural method, and that the hotel issue a public apology for facilitating the misappropriation. The punishment for non-compliance was a lawsuit seeking damages of $20 million. The viral video that had touched millions was now a weapon pointed directly at her heart. And the man who had wept over her coffee now had to decide whether to fight his own son's family in open court, risking everything for a ritual his mother once performed barefoot in a mud brick kitchen. The 7 steps had opened a door, just as Amina had promised. But what walked through was not just memory, it was war. Omar bin Rashid did not build a $4 billion empire by backing down from legal threats. Within hours of the cease and desist letter, he had mobilized a team of 20 attorneys specializing in international intellectual property law, cultural heritage statutes, and Emirati tribal custom. Their war room was not a glass-walled conference room in the Al Rashid Tower, but a modest majlis in his private residence, a circular space lined with carpets and cushions where his mother had once served coffee to visiting elders. He insisted on it. If they were going to fight for the soul of a tradition, they would do it from the place that tradition had been born. Layla sat beside him, the wooden box on the low table before them. She had made her decision. She would not take the Balashi offer, and she would not retreat. Khalid was also present, along with 2 scholars from the Omani Ministry of Heritage and a forensic linguist who specialized in ancient Gulf dialects. The team had one goal: prove that the 7-step ritual was a collective cultural inheritance, not a trade secret, and that the Al Rashid family manuscript, if reunited with its missing half, would establish prior public knowledge dating back at least 200 years. This was the legal equivalent of going to war with a coffee pot as your primary weapon, and it was exactly the kind of fight Omar had been waiting his whole life to wage. The strategy unfolded in 3 phases. Phase 1 was the public narrative. Rather than hide from the viral video, Omar decided to amplify it. He gave an exclusive interview to a major Arabic news network, sitting in the same majlis, the wooden box visible behind him. He told the world about his mother, about the morning she had taught him to grind the beans, and he had been too impatient to listen. He confessed the shame of a son who had built a fortune and lost a mother's wisdom. He named the al-Balashi legal threat directly and called it what it was: an attempt to privatize the soul of a people. The interview was watched by 40 million people in the first 48 hours. Public opinion, which had initially treated the story as a heartwarming curiosity, now had a villain and a hero. The Balashi legal team suddenly found themselves trending for all the wrong reasons. Phase 2 was the manuscript retrieval. The missing half, according to Khalid's intelligence, was not hidden in a Swiss vault or a corporate archive. It was in the possession of Khalid al-Balashi's elderly aunt, Mariam al-Balashi, a reclusive woman of 81 who lived in the same Al-Hajar mountain range where Layla's grandmother had once roasted beans. Mariam was ailing, cared for by a single Ethiopian nurse, and rumored to be deeply unhappy about the commercialization of her family's heritage. She had never approved of the patent applications. Omar, Layla, and Khalid chartered a helicopter and flew to the mountain village where the al-Balashi family had originated. They arrived unannounced, bearing only a thermos of coffee Layla had prepared that morning using the 7-step ritual. Mariam received them in a small courtyard shaded by a date palm. Her eyes were clouded with cataracts, but her mind was sharp. Layla poured the coffee into a fengel, presented it with her right hand, and touched her heart. Mariam drank. A long silence passed. Then she spoke in a voice like cracked earth. "I knew your grandmother. Amina was my friend before the families divided, before the men decided that a water well was worth killing over, and my brother used the fire to destroy the covenant. I have waited 50 years for someone to come who understood what was lost." She called for her nurse to bring a bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Inside was the missing half of the manuscript, its pages yellowed but intact, written in the same ancient dialect as the half in Omar's safe. Phase 3 was the unification. The 2 halves of the manuscript were brought together under the supervision of the forensic linguist, and the Heritage Ministry scholars. What they revealed rewrote the history of the feud. The fire that had destroyed half of Al Hissan 50 years ago was not, as everyone had believed, an act of aggression by the Balushi family against the Rashid family. It was an accident. A cooking fire, left unattended during a sandstorm, had spread from the Balushi compound to the Rashid compound. The elders of both families, in their grief and rage, had blamed each other. The feud that followed was built on a misunderstanding so profound that no one had ever checked the original accounts. The manuscript contained letters of condolence from the Balushi patriarch to the Rashid patriarch, letters that had never been delivered, intercepted by a cousin who saw opportunity in chaos. The truth had been buried for half a century. Layla, holding the two halves together for the first time, felt her grandmother's presence so strongly she had to steady herself against the table. The legal battle ended not with a dramatic courtroom scene, but with a single phone call. Khalid al-Balushi, confronted with the unified manuscript and his Aunt Miriam's sworn testimony, instructed his legal team to withdraw all claims. The patent applications were abandoned, the cease and desist was rescinded, and Tariq al-Rashid, Omar's son, was summoned to the majlis where Layla had brewed a fresh pot of coffee. Omar asked his son one question: "Did you know?" Tariq's face crumpled. He had known about the feud, but not its origins. He had married into the Balushi family believing he was building a business alliance that would eventually heal the rift. He had been wrong about the methods, but not the intention. Omar poured his son a cup of coffee, the same third full measure he had received weeks earlier. "Your mother's name was Amira," he said. "She was named after my mother's sister who died in the fire. The family you married into is not our enemy. They never were. We all lost the same people. We all forgot the same truth." Tariq drank the coffee, and for the first time in his adult life, he wept in his father's presence. The Living Museum in Al Hissan opened 8 months later, funded entirely by Omar's foundation and guided by Layla's knowledge. It was not a sterile exhibition space with glass cases and informational plaques. It was a working village, rebuilt in the traditional style, where elders from both the Rashid and Balushi tribes taught the 7-step ritual to anyone who came. The manuscript was housed in a small library, its pages digitally scanned and available to researchers worldwide, its physical copy resting beneath a photograph of Amina bint Rashid al-Jabri, whose hands had set everything in motion. Layla became the museum's first director. Her brother Yusuf graduated from engineering school and joined the foundation's infrastructure team, designing sustainable water systems for mountain villages. Her mother, whose medical debts had once seemed insurmountable, received treatment at a hospital in Muscat and lived to see her daughter honored by the Ministry of Culture. The hotel where Layla had worked offered her a lifetime complimentary suite and quietly renamed its coffee lounge the Amina Room, though Layla insisted they serve the coffee in proper fenjals, not paper cups. Khalid published a monograph on the ritual, dedicating it to both Amina and Miriam, the two grandmothers whose friendship had survived the feud in secret letters hidden beneath floorboards for decades. Omar bin Rashid lived another 6 years. He spent most of them in the museum's courtyard, sitting beneath that same date palm, watching young people learn the steps that his mother had once taught him. He died peacefully, holding a fenjal in his hand, the taste of cardamom on his lips. His funeral was attended by members of both the Rashid and Balushi families, who served coffee to each other for the first time in 2 generations. And as the mourners lifted their cups, Layla stood before them and spoke the words her grandmother had spoken to her a lifetime ago. "This is not coffee, this is a door, walk through it together." They did. The story of Layla and the billionaire is not really about coffee. It never was. Coffee was the vessel, the medium, the door, to borrow Amina's word, through which something far older and far more fragile passed between 2 strangers. What happened in that Dubai hotel was not a performance. It was a transmission. A thread that had been frayed by war, by greed, by time itself, was suddenly pulled taut again, vibrating with the accumulated memory of 12 generations. Think about what that really means. For 200 years, through famine and flood, through colonialism and oil booms, through the dismantling of villages and the rise of cities that scraped the sky, one family kept a recipe alive. Not written down, not patented, not monetized. Just held in the palms of grandmothers, passed from hand to hand like a secret that was never meant to be kept, but to be shared. Amina bint Rashid al-Jabri never sought recognition. She never appeared on a stage or gave an interview. She simply woke before dawn, roasted beans, and taught her granddaughter that hospitality is the highest form of human dignity. And that quiet act, repeated thousands of times in a mud brick kitchen, was enough to save a billionaire's soul. The tragedy is not that Omar forgot. The tragedy is that forgetting is so easy. Every culture on earth carries rituals that are slowly being abandoned, not because they lack value, but because the world has convinced us that the new is always better than the old. Faster coffee, instant coffee. Coffee in capsules and cans, stripped of rituals, stripped of meaning, reduced to a transaction. How many of us have grandmothers who know something precious, something that will die with them if we don't ask? How many traditions are one generation away from extinction, not because they were destroyed by war, but because nobody bothered to learn? The Al-Rashid manuscript, now housed in a stone library in the mountain village of Al-Hisn, contains more than recipes. It contains the names of every woman who carried the ritual, stretching back to time before borders, before oil, before the word billionaire had meaning. Layla's name is now among them, not as the end of the list, but as a bridge, because the museum she directs is not a mausoleum for a dead tradition. It is a classroom where young people from both feuding families learn to roast and grind and pour, their hands guided by elders who once refused to share the same road. The 7 steps are no longer a secret. They are a curriculum, and maybe that is the deepest lesson of this entire improbable story. The things we fight over, land, money, patents, pride, are almost never worth the cost of the fight. What is worth it is the coffee, the sitting down, the filling of a small cup 1/3 full and offering it to someone you were raised to call enemy. The ritual does not just honor the guest, it transforms the host. It takes someone who arrived demanding authenticity and leaves them humbled by the realization that authenticity was never lost, only locked away in a wooden box carried by a waitress who refused to forget. Layla still visits her grandmother's grave once a year, on the anniversary of her death. She brings a thermos of coffee, prepared exactly as Amina taught her, and she pours a single fengel and leaves it on the stone. She does not know if the dead can taste. But she knows that the ritual is not for the dead. It is for the living, who must carry forward what they have been given. The coffee cools, the wind blows, and somewhere, in a mountain village that nearly destroyed itself over a misunderstanding, children who were not yet born when the feud began are learning to hold a dollar with steady hands. If this story moved you, take a moment to consider what traditions your own family carries. Ask your grandmother, your grandfather, your eldest aunt, the keeper of your own culture's kitchen. Learn the recipe, write it down, perform it for someone who has never tasted it. You may not heal a 50-year feud, you may not save a billionaire's life, but you will open a door. And that is how the world changes, not in headlines, but in small cups offered freely, one at a time. Thank you for watching. If you believe that stories like this deserve to be told, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more documentaries that remind us what we are in danger of forgetting. We release new stories every week about the hidden rituals, the unsung heroes, and the traditions that still have the power to change lives. Until next time, remember, the most valuable things in this world cannot be bought. They can only be brewed and poured and shared.